Now, again, hello everyone. For everyone that doesn't know me, I'm Tim. I write about psychology and philosophy on my Substack, and today I'm very excited to greet my guest, Ben, because he's one of the reasons I changed my mind a lot in the last few months. And we're going to talk about idealism, consciousness, and God. Yeah, I think that's it. So, Ben, do you maybe want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, all easy subjects, man.
Yeah, fun
Um,
subject.
yeah, I'm Ben. I write Journey Through Reality. I speak about philosophy and religion and whatever else kind of springs to mind. So, broadly, yeah, like I'm an idealist when it comes to consciousness. I'm a theist. At least some people would consider me a theist. We can get into that maybe, but uh, yeah, excited to be here.
Very excited to have you. So I guess just jumping into the cold water directly, you are an idealist. What is idealism and why are you an idealist?
Good question. Idealism is a word that covers a broad range of um, beliefs and metaphysical kind of systems. Historically, idealism has been associated first kind of with like Aristotle and the hylomorphic kind of tradition that grows up in Christianity and stuff like that. At least in the West, obviously, the East has its own thing going on. But in the West, it becomes very much kind of entrenched in Christian philosophy and that kind of stuff. But at least when we're talking about modern philosophy, probably the most famous proponent of idealism is George Berkeley, who I think was a bishop in the Church of England, actually. Um, but he has more of a kind of reductionist modern take
Hmm.
on idealism. His version is what we might call subjective idealism. Um, and by that, I mean, that can mean a few different things, but at least for Berkeley, it means that he thinks everything exists within the minds of particular subjects.
Yeah.
So there's no like quote unquote objective reality. There's no such thing as a mind independent reality that kind of out is exists out there independent of observers. Um, I would consider myself an objective idealist, and I have kind of some overlaps with Bernardo Kastrup as well,
Mhm.
who is a very famous kind of contemporary proponent of idealism. His version he calls analytic idealism, but for me, it's just kind of like a particular take on objective idealism.
Yeah.
Um, and objective idealism would say, well, yeah, like everything exists within the mind or everything exists within consciousness, if you want to say that. But there is this kind of external objective reality.
Mhm.
It's just also mental. So the stuff out there is mental, and the stuff in kind of inside me is mental as well. And so uh, there's lots of different ways of thinking about that. But a way of thinking about it is to say that everything is just exists within one big mind,
Mhm.
um, and that subjectivity occurs because of dissociations from that one big mind. So Kastrup kind of appeals to this analogy of dissociation that we see in
Mhm.
patients with dissociative identity disorder. Um, and he will kind of flip flop on how far he pushes the analogy depending on who he's
Yeah.
speaking to. I firmly see it as an analogy, not something that to be taken completely literally. I don't think we are literally like dissociations in exactly the same way that we observe dissociation within DID. So speaking analogously, at least, um, the kind of if all reality is contained within this one big mind, um, then subjectivity happens when we kind of dissociate from kind of everything else that's going on broader from
Mhm.
us. You might want to think about like whirlpools within a river, something along those lines. So there's nothing to the whirlpool but the river, but nonetheless, it kind of forms this discrete kind of entity that you can like point to and say, this is the thing. But you can't take the whirlpool out the river and kind of have it retain its existence. Um, So in that sense, everything is in reality is reducible to this one mind or this one field of consciousness or to God or how there's lots of different ways you can approach this.
Mhm.
And I'm perfectly happy to use different frameworks to try and get at the issue. Some people are quite dogmatic about kind of one particular way of speaking, but I'm not like that. Um, so yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I've read that you were a neutral monist before, right?
Yeah.
So
So my first
what
kind of
yeah.
yeah, go on.
I just wanted to ask you what changed your mind to get from neutral monism to idealism?
Yeah, I think my kind of first breaking out of because like I was raised Christian and everything, and so
Yeah.
philosophy of mind didn't wasn't a big metaphysical kind of question. But when I kind of stepped away from Christianity for a while, I've now returned. I'm now a Christian again, but um, philosophy of mind kind of came to the forefront of like big challenges to the physicalist atheist kind of worldview that I was exploring, I guess, or interacting with. Um, and so I started listening to people like Philip Goff,
Mhm.
and I immediately found his arguments like super, super convincing. And so I was like, yeah, man, something like this panpsychism thing has to be true. Um, and I guess I at the time put more stock in this kind of I don't know what the best way to say it, like scientific, mechanistic, physicalist kind of way of
Mhm.
understanding reality, which I have since moved away from. I don't see any reason why that kind of way of interact or like way of modeling reality should be prioritized over other ones. Um, in fact, I see lots of reasons why it shouldn't be. And so I guess I was a neutral monist in that I saw um, kind of the descriptions that you see in physics as being fundamental
Mhm.
um, to reality. And now I don't think those things should be. Uh, yeah, what physics is doing seems to me is a project that is like necessarily incomplete.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I have since moved away from neutral monism, but yeah, I had a kind of brief stint in neutral monist panpsychist, kind of well, maybe more of like a Russellian monism. So like Russell, Philip Goff, Galen Strawson, this kind of type of panpsychism, which honestly is not super different from where I am
Mhm.
now, but it's
Yeah.
just I think what has changed is more how I interact with kind of the physical descriptions of the world, or what I see those as being, what their kind of ontological status is.
What is physical for you? What is stuff in your view? If everything is mind.
Stuff is an appearance of
Mhm.
mental activity or mental phenomena. Um, so one way of approaching this is to say that if you're like really sad,
Mhm.
you might cry, and in crying, I am observing something about your internal mental state at that particular time. And so that crying is an extrinsic appearance of your internal mental state. I don't have direct kind of access to whatever your
Mhm.
mental state is. Mental states are private, kind of like by definition. And so when I observe your behavior, what I'm observing, or like when I look at your body or when I look at your brain scans, I'm observing appearances of mental states.
Mhm.
Um, and so I just think everything that we're looking at on the other side of that appearance, there is a mental state
Mhm.
that corresponds to whatever uh, physical thing we are looking at, whether that be a body or a plant or I don't know, a rock
Yeah.
or I don't know,
I think that makes
whatever
sense.
else. Yeah.
I think that makes sense. But I think we already talked about when would you say does a mind start? So, for example, when we look at a rock, we wouldn't say that's a singular mind, right? That's more
Yeah.
part of the universal mind, then probably, right? Or how would you
Yeah.
describe it?
Since kind of diving into idealism, this has been a question that has haunted me.
Yeah.
Um, because in some sense, I think it's impossible to say.
Mm,
Um, because, the reason that I recognize that kind of like you have something going on in your head that's similar to what's going on in my head is because we share particular like behaviors that
mm,
are like externally observable. So like for example, like if you run up and punch me in the face, I'll probably like wince in pain and vice versa. Like if you're in pain, like there'll be certain behaviors that I can observe which correspond to that mental state, which allows me to be like to basically make an inference from that you are conscious in like a similar way that I am conscious. And I believe we can do the same thing. We can do the same thing with almost all animals, maybe with the exception of some insects and some fish and stuff like that, where things start to get more blurry. But at least for like mammals and stuff like
mm,
that, um, we can observe particular behaviors that would correlate to um, kind of mental states that we
mm,
share. So we can make this inference saying like we know that we're conscious, or I know that I'm conscious, and I could observe similar behaviors in you that I display, and therefore I can infer that you're conscious.
mm,
But with something like a plant or a tree or a rock, it becomes a lot more difficult because they don't really display the same types of behaviors that humans do, at least for the large part. It is kind of creepy, like if you take footage of a plant and then like speed up the footage, it does really look like it's alive, especially like if you see a sunflower like turning to face the sun and stuff like that. So like things get a bit
yeah.
like fuzzy, I think, around the edges. But I think this conversation is further complicated because I think minds can exist within other minds.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is that like if everything exists within one big mind, like one infinite field of consciousness, right? And like we as human beings are dissociations from this. So we this subjectivity is created because we dissociate from everything else that's going on. Um, that doesn't create like, let's say that was just me, like I was the only mind in existence, and then there was mind at large.
mhm,
That doesn't mean there's two minds. That means there's one mind that has within it, kind of contained within it, another mind. It doesn't create like two separate entities, if
mm,
that makes sense.
yeah.
Um, and so, what you can, I guess, what you can kind of infer from this logic is that, like, um, there are, like, I guess, like ontological hierarchies of like minds and things like
Mm,
that we wouldn't even be aware of. So, for example, like, um, in the Christian tradition, it's very common to speak about like guardian angels and
mm,
patron saints and stuff like this. And I think one way of understanding that is to say, like when humans get together and share in an activity, there seems to be something that like arises out of that,
yeah.
which is greater than the sum of the parts, right? Like when there are like, especially in like negative situations, when there are like riots and stuff like that, people are like, well, there's this kind of like group
Mm,
like spirit or mindset that kind of like overtakes people and people get caught up in something um larger. There seems to be something that kind of like arises out of that interaction. But like from our perspective, it's not like that thing has like its own subjectivity and
mm,
like agency and stuff like that. But like why not? Like we might not have access to it, but at least theoretically, at least conceivably it could do, right? And so I'm not committing to the idea of saying like, I don't know, when people go to like a football game or whatever, and there's like a crowd, like that thing is its own mind. I'm not saying that
mm,
necessarily. But I am saying that minds can be contained within several other larger minds and also then composed of several smaller minds. And so I think it's kind of impossible to say, like, okay, like, does one of my neurons have its own
Mm.
subjectivity? Or, like, does an electron have, like, subjectivity? I don't really
Yeah.
know. I don't know the answer to that question. But is it part of a mind? Yeah, it's an appearance of a mind, but exactly where the parameters of that mind are and how many minds it's actually composed of, etc., etc. All of those kinds of questions. I'm quite agnostic about all of that,
Mm-hmm.
which maybe is not a satisfactory answer. But I think maybe, like, in principle, it's an impossible question to answer
Mm-hmm.
um, with, like, any level of certainty apart from the speculations that I just gave. So
Yeah, right. So would it be accurate to say that everything or everyone in this universal mind is what this mind does? So in a sort of more top-down fashion? Because I understand idealism more as this universal mind, and from this we can infer dissociated minds, and panpsychism is more this bottom-up process. Would you, or how would you describe the relation between us, so dissociated minds, and the universal mind?
yeah, I think this is a good question because uh, I guess, I mean, we have this conversation a lot,
Yeah.
and we talk to our friend Alex a lot about this kind of thing as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and this kind of question of, like, top down versus bottom up comes up quite a lot. And for me, I don't see them as being, like, in opposition
Mhm.
with each other.
Mm.
The reason I guess I favor a top down approach is because if you take a bottom up kind of narrative as being, like, fundamental, the fundamental story of reality, it seems like you have a near infinite amount of entities,
Mm.
like, in your, like, reduction base. Like, if
Mhm.
you're talking about, like, what is reality composed of, you've got, like, a near infinite amount of entities. Um, Whereas if you take a top down approach, you're going to say, well, there's one entity and then everything else kind of trickle down from that. Um, and so for me, that is more parsimonious to think of their, like, n- there's one thing and it's all just, like, appearances within that one thing. Um, but equally, you can tell a bottom up story. You can look really really close to see what the smallest thing we can see is, and then kind of, like, build the story from there. You can do that, and I'm not opposed to that. But I guess just conceivably, it's easier for me to kind of go from the one to the many rather than the many to the one.
Mm.
And I think it kind of makes more sense if you're kind of looking for parsimonious or simple metaphysical theory. Um, but what then is our relationship to, like, mind at large? It depends on what sense you mean. Like, we are largely dissociated from it.
Mhm.
Um, so, in the same way that, like, I can't read your thoughts, like, I don't know what is going on the other side of whatever, like, appearances are happening in kind of my um, phenomenological, physical world. Um, we as humans can get glimpses of that. I think we do get glimpses of that, like, with, like, psychedelics or, uh, like certain forms of meditation
Mhm.
or, like, I don't know, near death experiences and stuff like that. There seems to be these weird anomalous experiences that do kind of, like, at least partially reassociate us with, like, things that are broader going. People talk about this expansion of consciousness.
Yeah.
Um, but at least in our day-to-day lives, we are dissociated. We don't have access to kind of what's going on um, in mind at large. But we are kind of all part of mind at large. We're all kind of just, like, doings of the same thing. Um, and so all phenomena are happening within one field of stuff. Um, and in that sense, you can say kind of reality is fundamentally non-dual, like
Mhm.
it's non-dualistic. But at the same time, we interact with things as if they're discrete entities, and
Right.
we experience the world that way. And so, yeah, I guess it depends on what level of reality you're talking.
Right.
Because I like to make a strict kind of distinction between phenomenological reality, like how we experience the world, or what Kant would call phenomena, and then the noumena, or like ontological reality, how reality actually is. Because those two things seem to be distinct in some way. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think so. I think so. So, what, in your view, what can we and how can we learn about consciousness? Because in idealism, of course, there is basically only consciousness. So, what or how do you go about the hard question of consciousness? Or is there even a hard question?
Um, is there a hard problem of consciousness? I don't. If you think about, well, from like an idealist perspective, I don't
Yeah.
think there's a hard problem of consciousness. Um, that being said, like I think if you say like, well, everything is consciousness, then you've kind of escaped the problem. Like the
Hmm.
problem is unique to kind of physicalism and stuff like that. But equally, like I don't think that answers the question like what is consciousness? Like one of the
Yeah.
things that we spoke about with Ishmael last time, and you've posted about it since,
Yeah.
is that the question of what is consciousness, in my opinion, is kind of an impossible question to answer.
Right.
Um, because we know what the contents of consciousness are, we know what happens within our consciousness, um, and to some extent, we know kind of like we know something about what happens in other forms of consciousness. Like we know how like bats have echolocation, or we
Hmm.
know like lobsters can see more of the color spectrum that we can and stuff like that. And so we know that they have experiences that we don't have, but we don't know what they're like. Um, but that seems to be like what consciousness is like qua me or qua
Hmm.
you, like in reference to me, like what is my consciousness or what is your consciousness? But what is consciousness qua consciousness? I think is an impossible question to answer because it would entail stripping back all of the kind of like all of the contents of consciousness
Hmm.
and then being like, well, what's left?
Hmm. Okay. I
Um,
get it.
and I don't think you can really do that and come back with any um, answer that is expressible, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So would you say we can just intuit it by being conscious, just understanding it by its nature, or is that also in a way not really possible?
Well, I think we can. I think we have direct acquaintance with
Yeah.
like our consciousness, like like the problem I see with things like illusionism is that like if you are skeptical about kind of like your own experiences to that extent, it seems like you have like no basis for knowledge whatsoever. Like it seems to ruin epistemology like entirely because experience is kind of like the bedrock through
Mm-hmm.
which everything else kind of arises and through which you know everything else. And so I think if there's any candidate for something that you can be certain about, it's the contents of your own experience
Right.
or that you are experiencing. Um, but I don't think that necessarily answers the question of what consciousness is.
Mm-hmm.
It just answers the question of like, well, what's happening within my consciousness at any given moment. Um, but if you like froze time and like just had consciousness without excitation, like I don't know what that would be. I
Mm.
have no idea what that would be.
Okay, but do you think it exists without excitation? So do you think there
I think
is something else than the content of consciousness?
I think it has to. And again, we spoke about this with our in our live stream with Ishmael. Like, it seems inconceivable to me that there would be um, doings, but then like
Mm.
nothing doing the doings. If that makes sense,
Yeah.
like phenomena, but then like nothing. Like there isn't actually anything like doing the stuff, like doing the activity, um, or like having relations without the relator or whatever. Um, it seems to me like I don't know how I could conceive a reality where there is just stuff happening but nothing that's doing this stuff.
Yeah, because
um,
I guess that's what illusionism tries to get to. Consciousness without an observer. It's just multiple drafts conflicting and
yeah,
then consciousness
yeah.
or the
The boom
illusion of
consciousness.
consciousness
Yeah,
rather.
yeah. I don't. I just don't know how that could be possible. I don't understand. Like that seems like analytically untrue to me.
Mhm.
Um, and so I can't remember what your original question was.
I think that's it.
Okay,
So
cool.
so we can be relatively sure that we are conscious. At least
Yeah,
that's the best bet we have. So
yeah,
how do you get from there that everything else conscious too? What is the step you're taking here? Because I think
yeah.
that's what many people ask themselves. Uh,
Well, for me, it just seems like if you want to say that there are some things that are conscious
mhm.
and that there are other things that are not conscious, first you need to demonstrate when a thing becomes a thing, which is in itself very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And then second, you need to draw a well, you need to at least, it doesn't have to be a neat line, but you have to draw a line and say, well, on this side of the line, things are conscious, and then on the other side of the line, things are not conscious.
Mhm.
And I think any line you draw is completely arbitrary. Um, at some points, saying that like life was conscious and then like non-life was is unconscious. Um, I think that made sense before we understood kind of biology better.
Mhm.
It also would have made stuff like plants conscious, um, which some people want to reject. And so, this kind of stuff is hard. Like trying to give a definition of conscious that includes everything that you want, that you like intuitively want to include and excludes everything you intuitively want to exclude is really, really difficult.
Mhm.
Because you want to say, well, like obviously a rock isn't conscious. Well, okay, maybe not in the same way that we are conscious, but is it conceivable that a rock could have some sort of very, very primitive awareness, um, or not like sensory input, but like some sort of just very, very simple conscious experience? I mean, that's definitely conceivable. It would be nothing like the way in which we are conscious. I would kind of admit that from the outset. And so if you think saying that like everything is conscious is a problematic statement, then I'm kind of like there with you. Um, but also it kind of poses a broader question of like what is a thing,
Mhm.
because we know the boundaries of our own being, because if I took a pin and stabbed it into my skin, I would feel it. But if I stabbed it into this book that's next to me or whatever, then I wouldn't feel it. So we know that there are boundaries to what we are,
Mhm.
and we kind of infer that you, like other human beings and other beings like humans, have the same boundaries for the same reasons I elucidated earlier. Um, but to say like, okay, like when does a rock become a rock and not a bigger part of a mountain? Or like if you take a rock and then like break it in half, do you create like two new entities? Like meteorology is really difficult, basically. And so I'm not going to commit to saying that like everything that we identify as humans as being a discrete object is conscious or is its own mind. I'm not going to commit to that. But I would say that because of our lack of ability to draw a line that's like non-arbitrary, um, it seems perfectly sensible to make an inference from that and conclude that, well, behind all appearances, there is mental states. Otherwise, we have to say, well, there are some appearances behind which are mental states and then some behind which there aren't.
Mm.
But I have never heard any coherent account of, one, why that would be the case, and two, how we would even possibly identify that.
So is it more like parsimony or simplicity? Because I think it's just more easy to, you know, if you look at yourself in a mirror, for example, you are conscious, but you look like a physical object from the outside. So is it just parsimony that you take the leap to say that, well, maybe everything else physical has this inner state, or at least is part of some experience? Or is there any logical reason? Because I think for me, that's
There's
the
no,
problem with idealism, that I'm
yeah,
not really confident to take that deep.
I can't give you like a deductive argument that lands there. I don't. I'm very suspicious of deductive arguments when it comes to metaphysics because I don't
Mm,
think anytime anyone presents a deductive argument for metaphysics, it always includes like really controversial premises that like entail appealing to like a billion other kind of
mm,
like intuitions or other phenomena to like justify themselves, especially when it comes to like arguments for God and stuff like that. Like if you take the like Kalam cosmological argument or whatever, like it seems simple at first, but then actually when you like think about it, you realize that the premises are actually really, really controversial and stuff like that. I would rather like just like do away with all that and say I'm working in the realm of abduction. I'm
mm,
saying this is an inference of the best explanation. I don't think physicalism works. I don't think some forms of panpsychism work. I don't think dualism works. Okay, so I'm left with this. Compared to those options, it seems to me that idealism can account for everything,
mm,
account for it well, and also be parsimonious at the same time. So
mm.
I guess it's a broader, like, parsimony is one consideration, but there are several kind of like theoretical virtues that I would look for, um, including explanatory power, and I'm not going to be able to remember the rest of them at the same off the top of my head now.
That's okay.
Yeah,
That's okay.
basically, like, yeah, the theoretical virtues, the same sort of things that we look for in scientific theories.
Mhm. So, what would the brain tell you? If it's just an appearance, what do you think is actually the sense in looking at the brain, or neuroscience, for example? What do you think? Why should we do that still under idealism?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm no expert in cognitive science and or psychology or neuroscience or whatever. So, like, take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
There are people who are far more educated about this kind of stuff than I am. But like, even if thing like what we call the physical is like just an appearance of mental states, it's kind of still important to build a model of what the physical is because that's how we kind of interact with reality.
Mm,
And so if we want to be able to fix someone's brain if they have a brain injury or whatever else, I'm not a doctor, okay?
yeah.
But if we want to help people who have brain injuries or whatever else, we need to be able to understand the mechanics of the brain. And so modeling the creating like a map of the kind of like of the physical, the relations between things and how they work and how we can influence them causally is important. I mean, knowledge for knowledge's sake is pretty cool. But also like it has pragmatic value in the sense that we can then do things with that knowledge,
Mm,
primarily medicine and that kind of stuff. So Yeah, I would say that's the benefit of doing that.
Okay. I think Kastrup once said something very interesting. I think he said that the brain gives us like a third person point of view into the mentation of a person, like a more objective view, and what exactly, which mechanisms are exactly happening in the brain or in the mind of this person. Would you say
Yeah, I
that
think
makes
yeah, that makes sense to me. Because what we're doing is we're finding like the correlations between appearances and internal mental states. So we're building a map between the extrinsic and intrinsic, essentially, um, and by doing so, we get greater insight into kind of what's going on in other people's minds and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think it's valuable for that reason.
okay? And what would you say that science generally tells us? What is science doing actually? Because it just works with appearances, right?
What is science doing? That's a very good question. Well, um, okay. I'm trying. I want to say this in the most non-controversial way, but like, okay, science is important. Let's get that out of the way. Like, science is important. Okay, there is lots of cool stuff we can do with science. We've managed to put men on the moon. We can build bridges. We can heal people. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that we can do with science. Beyond those pragmatic considerations, it seems to me that science is extremely limited in the scope of its inquiry,
Hmm.
and kind of like deliberately so. Obviously, science arises out of philosophy. Um, and so, like, once we had settled the kind of questions that science would be investigating and the methodology by which they would be investigating it, um, then kind of science became its own thing, and philosophy could just leave it alone and be like, "You go, man." Um, but those questions and those considerations and that methodology means the theories that science produces are necessarily limited.
Hmm.
Um, and so I don't think physicists are modeling the fundamental nature of reality. Um, Sorry to the physicists out there. Like, they're doing amazing work, but they are working within the realm of the phenomena
Hmm.
rather than the noumena. And so, in that sense, physics is always going to be like incomplete. It will never exhaustively account for all of reality. But that's okay. No one was asking it to do that in the first. Well, maybe some people were. I don't know, but I'm not asking it to do that, at least. And I guess a lot of people who are interested in philosophy aren't asking it to do that either. Um, and so, science is a conglomerate of different subjects. It's hard to really put them into one category. So, kind of doing different things, like physics, biology, and chemistry are all kind of doing different things at different levels. Um, but yeah, science is building models of the appearances of mental states,
Hmm.
essentially, is what they're
So,
doing.
so would you say it really can tell us anything, or is there at least something it can tell us? So I guess I'm just asking, are you an anti-realist or indirect realist?
No, I am an anti-realist. Sorry, guys.
Okay. Okay.
Um, yeah, yeah. Insofar as that science is dealing with, uh, as Kastrup says, like convenient fictions.
Hmm.
They're kind of heuristic models that work for what we need them to work for, and we act as if lots of entities exist. Like, there's this force called gravity, until we realize that gravity is the warping of space time and all this kind of like weird shit. Um, we're always updating our narrative to kind of better account for all the data and make it more workable, more useful. But that model is never complete. That model is never exhaustive. It's just if we act as if this is the case, then we can get certain results, and that's very useful and that's very good. Um, but do I think science is telling us about the fundamental nature of reality? No, I don't.
Okay. So would you say it's important that there are multiple or more diverse field of metaphysics in science, or is it completely irrelevant if they aren't telling us something about reality anyway?
Yeah, I go back and forth about this question actually. Like, I mean, a lot of scientists are kind of like physicalists by default, but they haven't
Yeah.
really thought about it, nor are they really treating physicalism as if it's a metaphysics.
Mm.
Um, or they're unconsciously kind of collapsing metaphysics into physics and and all this kind of stuff, all of
Yeah.
which are problems.
Yeah.
So it's not that I don't think that, like, if you're an idealist and you're approaching physics, maybe you'll approach it in a different way than someone who's a hardcore physicalist. I don't know exactly. I don't know enough about physics or any other field of science to say, but it would be interesting to see if it made a difference to how things are interpreted, how experiments are set up, um, how our models are expressed. And if it makes a tangible difference, then I think it's important to have a diversity of metaphysical views within the field, or at least some awareness of kind of like the different um, like metaphysical theories and stuff like that. So I would like to see scientists do more philosophy of science and kind of be more aware of philosophy in general. Um, but how much of a difference it would really make, I don't know. I don't know enough about science, but it would definitely be interesting to see.
Mhm. So I'm just going to read this question by Joseph. I think it's a good question. But what do you mean by the fundamental nature of reality? What is it that science can tell us about that metaphysics can?
Yeah. So it seems to me that metaphysics is speculating about what the noumena is,
Hmm.
basically. If science is telling us about the phenomena, then metaphysics is telling us literally what lies behind the phenomena. And so, like I said earlier, like the question, like what is consciousness, is kind of an impossible question. But we can still make particular speculations, make inferences, give analogies, all of this kind of stuff. And that's the business of metaphysics, essentially. Like, I think we are dealing purely with analogies or apophatic statements. I'm a big fan of like apophatic theology, which is to say, we don't know what the fundamental nature of reality is, but we can say what it is not.
Hmm.
Or we can make analogous statements about it. And so metaphysics is inquiring about what lies behind the phenomena. It's never doing so with any level of certainty. It's always doing so in the field in kind of like with abductive logic and making inferences to the best explanation rather than kind of deductive arguments and that kind of stuff. In my opinion, this is how I approach metaphysics anyway. Um, and so I think science is necessarily and deliberately limited to the phenomena rather than the noumena.
But do you think the phenomena can tell us anything about the noumena? Is it really like a boundary, or
I
is it?
think it can. I think it could tell us some stuff, right? So,
Mm.
like how I was saying earlier, like if you're crying, that gives particular signals to me about like what your internal mental states are, right? Um, whether that be what happy and sad crying are kind of different, but let's say sad crying, like it's negative, or like it has a heavy feeling, or it's not a good thing, or it's overwhelming.
Mm.
I can make these inferences by observing the phenomena. Um, so in the same way, we might be able to make inferences about the noumena from
Mm.
phenomena, but we have to be careful not to anthropomorphize everything. That's the risk, I think, because it's a bit easier with humans because we have our own experiences and then we can basically use the power of empathy to be like, this person's probably having a similar experience to me. I don't know with any certainty whether it is actually the same experience. For all I know, when you cry, it could be a really positive feeling that you're feeling inside. Like I don't know that with any level of certainty, but I can make safe inferences, I think. But then we've got to be careful not to just like anthropomorphize reality and be like, well, everything that's happening is something akin to what's happening in human consciousness. I
Mhm.
think that's dangerous. So yes and no, I guess is my answer.
Okay. So I guess what many people will do then is just become a pragmatist, right? Because if the phenomena is not really telling us so much about the noumena, why not just, stay with them? Why not just use them and not care about noumena at all?
I think if you want to do that, that's perfectly understandable.
Mm.
Like, I respect pragmatism a lot, and I'm very sympathetic to pragmatism. But there's also this kind of like wild, reckless side of me that's kind of just like, fuck it, we'll do it anyway. Like, we'll just give it a go and see what we come up with. Um, and like, look, I don't think we can answer these questions with any level of certainty. Like, these
Mm.
deep philosophical, fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the nature of humanity and kind of meaning and value and all these kinds of things. Like, I don't think we are in the business of certainty when it comes to this kind of stuff. But it's still fun, man, and I think it's still like valuable. Like, I think um the pursuit of knowledge, if we're going to say that like a pragmatic approach to knowledge is valuable, then I think it's also fine to just be like, knowledge for the sake of knowledge is valuable.
Mm.
And so the pursuit of knowledge is a noble pursuit, whether or not we can land kind of in very safe, certain, with very safe, certain answers. Um, and so, yeah, like, if you want to be a pragmatist or like a quietist or whatever, then like, go ahead. Like, I can't stop you. Like, not everyone has to be interested in every question. You know, like, if you start talking chemistry to me, I'm gonna, like, my brain's gonna switch off. Like, I
Mm.
don't care. But I'm really grateful that there are people who are studying chemistry and focusing on that and dedicating their life to it. And equally, like, I like philosophy, I like theology, I like religion, this kind of stuff. If people don't, then whatever, man. Like, I can't force you to like to to value these things if you don't already. I can try and show you why it can be valuable, but that may or may not be convincing. Um, and so, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to pragmatism.
Mm.
But there's also this side of me that just thinks, let's just give it our best shot. Why not?
Yeah, I mean that's what metaphysics is in a sense, right? So
Yeah,
I think that's a noble pursuit. And I guess I'm switching topics now a bit because you also talk a lot about religion, right?
yeah.
And so my question is, from this universal field of mind, right? We have now posited that everything in some sense is conscious and we are objective idealists now. So how do you get from there to God?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think, oh, we've got to be careful with this kind of stuff because sometimes people treat the question of theism as if there's like a certain list of propositions that we either like, or like criteria that we either meet or we don't meet. Um, but to me, that's a weird way of approaching the subject. Like, in what other field do we have this kind of like um a priori, arbitrarily chosen set of criteria that we kind of like try and fit ourselves into? Like,
Mhm.
I don't feel like we're doing that. We'd just take an honest look at what reality is, and then we try and build a model of that which makes sense. And so, for me, the ways in which God has been described throughout time by various religious traditions, by various theologians, those are attempts to get at the noumena, I guess, kind of like approach this metaphysical, fundamental level of reality that we don't have direct access to, but yeah, we're speculating about, usually on the basis of some sort of religious or mystical experience and stuff like that. That is often how these kind of things develop within religions. Um, that tied with kind of like philosophical investigation and kind of the application of reason broadly construed to these types of questions. And so when I speak about, or when I use the word God, I'm just using that as a placeholder for whatever the fundamental nature of reality actually is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel committed to saying, well, God is therefore like this, and this, like the four omnis or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I think the ways in which at least classical theists have described God are very useful. As long as we understand what it's actually doing. Because if we approach, like, let's take omnipotence, for example, if we take that property and try and analyze it as if it is kind of like something that we can like fully grasp, like what it is, um, with in kind of like holistically and logically, we're going to run into all sorts of paradoxes. Like, there's lots of famous paradoxes. Like, can God create a stone that he can't lift, or can God create another God who's better than he is, or can God do something evil if God is good, and all this kind of stuff. And traditionally, the answer from Christians has been no. God can't do those things. Well, okay, well, doesn't that contradict God's omnipotence? Well, okay, like when we say omnipotence, what we mean is like everything that is possible, everything that happens because of God, or God is like directly doing those things,
Mm-hmm.
or happens within God, however you want to think about it. And so, like, God can do everything that's like possible. That's one way of thinking about omnipotence. And so, when we use the word power, when we say all powerful, that's like an analogy, essentially. Or, for example, if we say God is infinite, well, that's not an analogy. That's an apophatic statement.
Mm-hmm.
So we're saying what God is not. We're not saying what God is. We're not
Mm-hmm.
committing to anything. We're just saying God is not a finite thing like you and I are, or this table is, or my water bottle, or whatever. God is not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
God is thingness, or God is not a being. God is being itself, right? So when we're making theological statements, like in the same, basically, I see theology and metaphysics as doing the same thing. Essentially, we're either speaking analogously or we're speaking in apophatic terms. And so, with that said, like, I think if you think about what the universal mind might be, and think about how that kind of relates to the attributes that have traditionally been used to describe kind of the nature of God and stuff like that, I think they line up pretty well, basically. Um, Now, it's not a perfect one-to-one correlation. I don't feel like I'm committed to all the ways in which God has been described by various religions throughout history and stuff like that. Obviously, at times, God has been very anthropomorphized. At other times, God is this completely abstract, like non-being kind of thing, or not even a thing. Almost like a black hole, basically, like the absence of stuff, essentially. Or like in like Buddhism, you've got the idea of emptiness. Like, there are all these different ways of approaching the subject, and I guess I'm just saying that basically, whatever the noumena is, like whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, that's identical to the thing that people have described as being God.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about God, are we also bound to phenomena? So in other words, what about the Bible, for example, or religious experience, as Joseph just wrote? Is that too bound to the world of appearance, or what can we and how can we learn about God?
Well, it's the same thing I was saying earlier. Like, we as humans always like to use things we know about to try and tell us about things that transcends that stuff. So obviously, there's lots of imagery in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, that's very anthropomorphic. It's talking about God like walking through the Garden of Eden, or
Mm.
God's right arm, and stuff like this. But these are analogies and metaphors and images to try and help paint a picture of the kind of like what God might be like. But again, that's all it is. It's just like an analogy,
Mm-hmm.
or it's an apophatic statement. Um, like there's a very strong uh, mystical tradition within Christianity, which takes apophaticism very, very, very seriously. So, like for example, like in the Gospel of John, it says God is love, right? But then a figure like Pseudo Dionysius, who was writing in the scholars disagree when he was writing, but let's just say the 4th century. Um, he's going to say, well, God is like God. God isn't love. If by love we mean like the way that humans display love or embody love, but God is also not love.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, basically, he's going to be like, there are better and worse ways of describing God, but ultimately, God completely transcends anything we can and can't say about him. And so, in some sense, yes, we are limited by the very fact we are human. Like, the way we think is in terms of the phenomena. And so, whatever we project into the noumena is going to be, to some extent, always slightly incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the epistemic position we're in. And either you say, well, then therefore it's a useless pursuit. Again, that lands you in pragmatism again. That's fine. If you want to say that, that's fine. But yeah, I guess I just like, yeah, I'm a bit more reckless than that.
So how do you choose the correct analogy then? Because obviously there are multiple religions. How do you get to, for example, Christianity?
I don't think there is a correct.
The
I
most
don't think there
fitting
is a
one.
correct. Yeah, there are more or less fitting analogies, but I
Yeah.
don't think there is like one correct way of approaching God. Ishmael just said theistic error theorism. Yeah, yeah. I think in some sense, yeah. Basically, everything we say about God is going to be infinitely more wrong than it is right,
Mm-hmm.
because we are finite and God is infinite. So literally, there's an infinite divide between us and God, right? Um, having said that, if we are going to try and speak, there are slightly better or worse ways of speaking. So saying God is love is more accurate than saying God is evil, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Um, now, like, what ends up being like, what is correct? Like, how do you tell what is correct and what isn't? That's a very, very difficult question. And again, like, we're gonna have to intuitively posit some like fundamental values by which we kind of adjudicate this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing so, like, we're just using our intuition. There's nothing else we can't really get around that. Like when we're positing theoretical virtues or the laws of logic or whatever, um, we're just postulating brute facts. And like we're doing so through the use of intuition. We're just having to say that like intuitively, a theory that postulates less entities but with the same explanatory power is just a better theory, and that's just the case. Um, like anyone could come across along and just be like, "No, it isn't, man. Like, why should I think that?" And I'm just going to be like, "Just because it is. Like, it just is." Um, and so I think if the way you speak about God is can account well for the way in which he's been experienced throughout history, and the ways in which particular people and communities kind of, yeah, I guess like, yeah, basically experience of the presence of God in their lives. I think that's good. Like most people experience God as being loving rather than evil, for example. But also if you can account for like a greater number of different experiences and synthesize them, and like for me, like if you can take a bunch of different religious doctrines that may seem at odds and then synthesize them, you're probably closer to what is actually going on. It's kind of like the Hegelian synthesis sort of stuff. But you have to accept that, like, even your synthesis is going to be someone else's antithesis or thesis or whatever. And so, like, we can try and create an accurate model, but we just have to have some level of epistemic humility and be like, ultimately we don't really know.
Hmm. So why are you Christian then?
Why am I Christian? That's a good question. I'm Christian for pretty much entirely pragmatic reasons.
Hmm.
Um, in the sense that it is the religious culture I was raised in. It's the theological language I was given. It's the tradition that I find myself in, kind of like within the UK. I mean, we're pretty much a post-Christian country at this point, but at least at some point we were a Christian culture. So, like, my cultural religious heritage is Christian. And so, for example, like, after I'd left Christianity for a little while, I explored Buddhism and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Buddhist center, like I did the meditation, I went to the classes and stuff like that. And there was so much stuff I valued from that experience. But it still felt trying to translate everything they were saying kind of like into a way that I could understand. It just seems like a different mindset, like in a different way of approaching things that is more appropriate for a particular culture in a particular time. Whereas I can go to any Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox church and immediately know what they're talking about and know what the hymns are about and understand that the language and stuff like that. And so, that, and just the fact that I just like going to church. Like, I just like, that is spiritually beneficial for me. And so, yes, I appreciate things like meditation and stuff like that, which, I mean, are part of the Christian tradition as much as they are in any other religion, like Buddhism, for example. And I think there are things that other religions can enrich about our own tradition. And there's lots that other religions can teach us. But just, I don't know, I just feel most comfortable in Christianity. And that's the only reason, like, but equally, like, I'm perfectly happy to go to a variety of different religious events or venerate different religious figures or whatever. Like, I would treat the Buddha as if he's a saint or like a figure like on par with Jesus,
Oops,
essentially.
my camera overheated, so we have no video for a few minutes now.
You've just disappeared. That's fine. They can look at
Okay.
my beautiful face instead. Yeah, so, like, I would see the Buddha like on par with a figure like Jesus, or like at the very least like a saint.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I feel comfortable stepping outside of Christianity in a variety of ways, but Christianity just feels like home. That's it, basically.
Right. So, I mean, Jesus is very central to Christianity, and connecting that back to objective idealism, who is Jesus in your framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Again, I think there are different ways of approaching this, because, like, the different dogmatic formulations that have been created throughout Christian history make total sense to me within the context of themselves. Basically,
Hmm.
within their own frameworks, they make sense. Within the frame of, like, objective idealism, they basically make no sense. Saying like Jesus is the Logos incarnate, like, what does that even mean when it comes to objective idealism? So if if you want to give an account of, like, the incarnation, for example,
Hmm.
you might have to employ language that the Christian tradition hasn't traditionally or historically employed. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I think Christianity is a ever shifting and developing thing, and it should learn from the best of contemporary philosophy and science in order to like explain itself and explain its doctrines and that kind of stuff. And so one way of thinking about it is to say that um, each of us as human beings have something of God within us. Like, so like according to the Christian tradition, we're made in the image of God, right? So in some sense, like there's nothing to us but God. But in another sense, like at least phenomenologically, like we experience this kind of like distance or this
Hmm.
dissociation from mind at large, right? Or God. Um, and so that can result in all sorts of like weird, like, uh, what's the best way to describe this? Like we're not always aligned with reality. Um,
Right.
one way of thinking about sin, for example, is like misalignment between our will and God's will, or kind of what reality intends for us and kind of like what we end up doing,
Hmm.
um, or the kind of thing we end up being. And so I'm trying to describe this without like just employing lots of theological language that people won't necessarily understand or appreciate. Um, so like Jesus, if we're thinking about it in terms of this, is like a human in the fullest sense.
Hmm.
And in being human in the fullest sense, he is therefore also perfectly in line and like perfectly reflects divinity. Um, he what's a good way of saying this? Like he is uh like a window through which we can see what God might be like, right? But also like there's nothing ontologically unique about Jesus. Jesus shows us what every human could be and shows us what every human should be and kind of like will be. Um,
Hmm.
and so, yeah, in that sense, Jesus is fully human, but also by being fully human, he's also fully divine. Um, because he's like perfectly aligned with the fundamental nature of reality, which is God in this kind of way of thinking. Does that make any sense?
I think that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's
It's
a
hard to
very,
get out of this stuff because it's hard
yeah.
to like say this in a way that like an analytic philosopher would appreciate. Because again, like you're trying to use analogies and stuff like that to gesture at something we can't really understand. And so that's one way of describing it. Obviously, like the Christian tradition has employed a variety of ways throughout history, um, including all sorts of fancy Greek philosophical language and that kind of stuff. But um, yeah, I think that's one way of saying it. That like that Jesus shows us what a human being is in its fullness,
Hmm.
um, and kind of shows us what our like destiny as human beings is, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm. It makes sense. Yeah. And something else I wanted to ask you. One of the biggest problems for Christianity in every religion is obviously the problem for evil. So,
Yeah.
how does idealism change anything about that problem, do you think?
Um, I think it does. Um, I am actually working on an article on this and have been for a while. Um, but I think there's a few things you could say. Like, so the first thing is to say that, like, I guess there's two problems. Like, there's the problem of like evil, and then there's like the problem of suffering.
Hmm.
So the problem of evil is like why the bad things happen, And then the problem of suffering is like, why do we have negative consequences? Because bad things happen. And so the problem of suffering is difficult to answer. But so here's the way I think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So according to the Christian tradition, we live in a fallen world. So there's this whole like mythology in the book of Genesis about like Adam and Eve eating the fruit and then being expelled from paradise and all this kind of stuff. I don't take that as being like a literal historical event.
Mm-hmm.
So what I take that as trying to get at is that when God creates, what happens is perfect unity. So perfect oneness gets split into multiplicity. So dissociations happen. So like new minds are created, if that makes sense. So you and I and every other human being and every other conscious thing comes into existence at particular points in time. And a necessary consequence of multiplicity being born out of unity is the possibility of disharmony, which is to say, when you have perfect unity, things are perfectly in harmony. Things are relating in the way that they should be.
Mm-hmm.
Because unity doesn't necessarily mean you only have one thing. No, it can mean that. But it means that all things are united under some sort of common purpose, or like they're relating in the proper way. So when you create multiplicity out of unity and you hand over agency to that multiplicity, a necessary consequence of that is the fact that all of these multiple entities are not gonna kind of work together perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But God is not an idiot. So God didn't just like do this and was like, well, I don't know what to do now, man. So it seems to me that like time is just the experience of moving back into that unity. And so this also kind of relates to how I understand like heaven and hell and universalism and this kind of stuff, but to like try and avoid overly Christian language. Like reality is moving in a particular direction. Like there is a teleology to reality. There is a direction that reality is moving into. And it's into that unity again. So multiplicity is born out of unity and then they return back to unity. And so it seems to me that evil is basically, or the possibility of, let's say, human beings doing evil things, for example, happens because of this duality that's created, this multiplicity that's created. The very fact that you and I perceive a difference between ourselves, and in some sense there is a real distinction between you and I, right? Because of that creates an opportunity for me to do like harm to you and to you for you to suffer negative consequences. And so that just seems like analytically true. That's like just a logical consequence. And so it seems to me that it was basically logically impossible for God to create a perfect world.
Mm-hmm.
Like we live in the best possible world in the sense that Leibniz means, but emphasis on the possible rather than the best. Like this is the best possible form of reality God could create, but it's moving in the direction of perfection. So ultimately, there's this notion of universal reconciliation within some Christian theologians. And the idea of that, like ultimately at the end of time, everything will be united again and brought back into union, perfect union with God, essentially. and so unity will be created again. But that couldn't happen immediately. God couldn't just like snap his fingers. Like if he wanted to create, this is a consequence of creation, but he doesn't just leave it that way. He moves everything slowly, without coercion, back into
Hmm.
perfect unity. So hopefully that makes sense. It's not like a case closed answer
Hmm.
to the problem of evil, um, but it does give an account of why evil exists in the first place, and then what God is doing about it. If that makes
Hmm.
sense.
So does it also make sense to say that in some sense God is participating in the suffering? Because I mean, in idealism, everyone is part of this universal might, and
Yeah.
so
So
yeah.
it it's impossible to say like whether if I suffer, like does God experience that suffering?
Hmm.
Well, I don't know. Like, does God even have experiences? Like, it's very hard to say. Like, God exists outside in space and time. So, like, what I was saying earlier, like, what is consciousness if you strip all contents away? Like, that's what God is. Um, and so, like, I don't think we can say literally God experiences my suffering, but God is fully present in that suffering. Like, he's
Hmm.
not distant at all. Um, and I think the image of the cross is really powerful in this because it's literally the image of God entering into some of the deepest suffering that's possible for a human being. And I think that in kind of a mythological way tells us that God is not like distant from us. Yeah, he's not far from us when we're suffering. Let's put it that way.
Hmm. It's very interesting. I think that's also a very big advantage in some sense of idealism, right? Because I think suffering in a world where God is in some sense part and we are part of God, I think that's a way better way to put it in some sense at least.
Yeah, it feels more palatable than like the idea that God and creation are like entirely separate. And that God is just like chilling up in the sky somewhere. Like we're all down here like
Mm.
having a terrible time, and like he's up there chilling with his bros or whatever. Um, like yeah, I think that picture is understandably unpalatable.
Right. So, but is God then also part in sinning? I think Joseph just wrote something similar. Is he also part in doing bad things?
Well, yes and no. Like God doesn't necessarily like cause us to
Hmm.
sin. Like we have our own agency as human beings. Um, but every sin is also in some sense part of God's ultimate plan of moving towards this unity again.
Hmm.
Um, and so there is a sense in which like we have free will, like we have our own agency, we are responsible for our own actions. But kind of like if you zoomed all the way out and like stepped outside of time, like everything that happens has already happened in eternity and is always happening in eternity.
Hmm.
Um, and so is ultimately part of one big. Using the word plan is a bit cringy because it's like abused by a lot of Christians. Um, but let's just say God will use our choices to bring us back into unity with Himself. And so like, it's not like God is like sinning. Like to sin is to be in misalignment with God's will. But have you ever read the Silmarillion
No,
by
no,
Tolkien?
if not.
So it's basically Tolkien's Book of
Hmm.
Genesis. So there's this story of creation, um, where um, creation is like sung into existence,
Hmm.
and then he kind of has like this one angel who like starts singing its own melody, and I think that's like meant to be a metaphor for Satan or Lucifer. Um, but the idea is that God will basically slowly change the music
Hmm.
until that initial disharmony is brought back into a holistic harmony. Um, so like God will work with us essentially, um, to yeah, bring everything back into unity, if that makes sense.
Hmm. It makes sense. Yeah. And so I think it's very interesting in your year to look at these constructs of Christianity and religion in general. For example, how or what in your view is, for example, hell or heaven? Does that exist even?
Um, yeah, it's I guess one way of saying it is like hell and heaven are like states of being or
Hmm.
like modes of being. Um, and to be clear, like I absolutely reject the idea of eternal conscious torment. I think
Hmm.
that's a horrible idea that's been cooked up in the minds of some Christians or even the mainstream Christian tradition. I think it's unconscionable. I think it's disgusting. Like, yeah, I have no patience for eternal conscious torment. That said, hell exists insofar that like we can make like people talk about like the idea of like our someone's life being like a living hell.
Hmm.
Like through our own choices, we can like completely fuck up our lives. Um, and the result is something akin to hell, basically. Like it's absolute suffering, it's disharmony with ourselves and everything around us. Um, and so, like, we can do that, but that state is always temporary. Um, and the ultimate state of reality will be this unity, um, which is basically something akin to heaven or human flourishing in the most
Hmm.
holistic way that you can conceive of that. Um, so yeah, yeah, basically.
So does death then lead to unity with God? Is that the definition?
Um, Not necessarily because when you well, I mean, there's a couple of things that could happen when you die. So, like, obviously, like under idealism, like your consciousness doesn't like it can't cease to
Hmm.
exist. It's like everything is consciousness. So either like your subjectivity just dissipates and like you completely reassociate, and so everything it means to be you ceases to exist,
Hmm.
or that happens but kind of like on a partial basis. So there is like a change in the way that your consciousness exists, but it's not completely like deleted. Um, I think if we think about death like that, and then we also think about something like reincarnation or like some ideas of like rebirth and stuff like that, um, what we end up with is an idea that, bearing in mind, like our consciousness exists eternally because it's just part of God's consciousness, right? It's just part of this kind of like infinite field of consciousness. So, in some sense, like we are eternal beings, but like let's not get that weird. Like me as this construct that I call Ben will
Hmm.
not exist for all eternity. It's not like just time like goes on forever and there's this infinite succession of moments and like me as like in the sense that like I currently exist will exist forever. Um, but there is a sense in which there's a continuity between me now,
Hmm.
me in 1 minute, me in 10 years, in 30 years, in 50 years. Even though I imagine I would be a very different person then than I am now. And I was a very different person 5 years ago than I am now, for example. But nonetheless, there's this continuity. There's this kind of like line you can draw between the two. I think that will continue after death infinitely. And
Hmm.
it's quite likely that we will experience lots of events that are something akin to death throughout our kind of like eternal life, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Um, but that's like an infinite journey. Like God is infinite, and so the journey towards him, the journey towards reassociation, if you will, or like
Journey through reality, right?
the journey through reality. um, yeah, that journey towards perfect unity with God is an endless, infinite journey.
Mhm.
That's never ending. So if I had to guess, the kind of like Eastern religions and some pagan religions that kind of like believed in reincarnation and stuff like that, or rebirth, were kind of getting at this idea that there are probably lots of events in our, even in our human life, there are lots of events that we could probably point to and be like, damn, that felt like death. Like there was a part of me that died during that event, and I'm just
Mhm.
like a drastically new person than I was. Um, and so I think there will be lots of events like those that will be point to and be like, that is something akin uh, to death. The difference, like in when we're talking about biological death, the one thing that we do know, it means that our consciousness will change in a way that makes it non-perceptible to other humans around us.
Mhm.
And so we will disappear from the realm of appearances. We know that for sure because when people die, we can no longer speak to them. We can no longer interact with them in the same way. I mean, people can take all sorts of drugs or have weird experiences where they feel like they're contacting their loved ones. And I'm not here to poo-poo that, but
Mhm.
we know for sure that like you become, in some sense, imperceptible to humans. And so your consciousness will certainly change. How it changes and what exactly that means, I don't know.
Mhm. So I think that's a very beautiful, beautiful answer. And so I'm going to get to the last question, and that is, you have changed your mind a lot from, neutral monism to idealism and back to Christianity. What would it take to change your mind again?
Oh, probably not a lot, to be honest. I feel like I'm changing my mind all the time. And I
Mhm.
feel like we have potentially, like when we read like older philosophers and stuff like that, we might have this perception that they didn't really change their mind much because either like we read one of their works and that's like their most famous thing. And then we don't kind of like read their other stuff. We certainly don't read their stuff from like later in life or earlier in life. Um, and so we usually interact with people in particular moments, and then we come away the impression that they didn't really change their mind very much. But that's almost certainly not the case. Like
Mhm.
any good philosopher is going to change their mind throughout their lives. I hope. Otherwise, I don't know what they're doing, man. Like they're not doing philosophy if they're not changing their mind. Um, I think potentially, like I have ADHD, so I think I changed my mind probably. I'm quite quick to adopt ideas. I'm quite reckless intellectually. I don't wait around. If think something, I think something. Like I'm not going to mess about with it. And so potentially I change my mind quicker than other people, but um, I don't think uh, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think
Mhm.
changing your mind can be a virtue. That doesn't mean we should be like so open-minded that our brain falls out. But I
Mhm.
think it does mean that um, we should always be open to new perspectives and always be open to changing what we think.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful endpoint. Um, so yeah, thank you very much for joining. I think it was a great talk, and you had very, very interesting answers, and I learned a lot again about idealism. And thanks for everyone joining, and sorry for my camera. Um, but I think it will work next time. I hope, at least. And so, yeah, do you have anything to say, Ben?
No, I think that's everything. Thanks for having me, Tim. It's been fun.
Nice, nice. So, have a great day, and see you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.